Hello, back with Pro Tools I/O setup window. I've gotten a few questions about this recently, and this is kind of a starting point for I/O setup, and it will get a little bit deeper in the next video that I do for I/O setup window for Dolby Atmos. But let's forget about that for a second and dig right in. I'm on Pro Tools 2024.6, and the I/O setup window, everybody's favorite window for Pro Tools. And I just want to share a little bit of info that will hopefully make this easier to use. The I/O setup allows you to configure the inputs and the outputs and the busing inside Pro Tools. And it's based off of the Pro Tools playback engine. Right now, I have a couple of different playback options available to me on my Pro Tools system. And when I say playback engine, I mean audio hardware. This is Pro Tools with a playback engine of Scarlett 2i2. That means 2 inputs and 2 outputs. If I go to the I/O setup, it should show on the input tab. I have 2 inputs only. Here's my hardware. This is an abbreviation for the Focusrite 2i2. And then the output, I have only 2 outputs. I have changed the playback engine to Pro Tools Aggregate I/O. Let's take a look at the I/O setup. And you'll see that the input has no inputs because this is a Mac Pro. It doesn't have a microphone. It doesn't have any audio inputs into the system. So Pro Tools Aggregate has nothing to work with here. Output, it's Mac Pro speakers. I have a left and a right speaker, and the buses kind of reflect that, right? So this Pro Tools system previously had another playback engine with a bunch more outputs. They are not available right now. So these come up as NA, not available. Now I have changed the playback engine to HDX. I have an HDX card with an Avid Matrix Studio audio interface. If I click OK here and we look at the I/O setup now, it will show 32 inputs and 32 outputs. I actually have access to up to 64, but I've only got 32 assigned. And if I go to the bus tab, all of the outputs are mapped properly and the outputs are available. So there's 3 examples of a few different playback engines in Pro Tools. I have a total of 32 inputs. These are assigned to my Pro Tools software, 32 inputs. Now with the Matrix Studio, they could be analog inputs. They could be Dante inputs, they could be ADAT inputs, whatever I want them to be, because those are all available on my Matrix Studio audio interface. Now, other interfaces will probably have a combination of analog and or digital in the form of SPDIF or AES, or maybe Dante as well. So it all depends on what your audio interface is. Now, so the inputs, that's pretty straight ahead. Input 1 and 2, that's going to be Pro Tools 1 and 2. Now, output gets a little more, I don't want to say complicated, but there's a little bit more involved. So the output tab is looking directly at my audio interface outputs, in this case 1 through 32. I've got them configured to a variety of outputs, analog outputs, a couple of Dante outputs, etc. And that's totally optional what you want to do. The bus tab will allow me to define what are internal buses or output buses or external buses. Any of these paths that are checked in the mapping to output tab are assigned to physical outputs. This list of physical outputs directly corresponds to my output list in the output tab. And I'm going to show you an example of how this works in a little bit here. But the buses below here that are not mapped to an output are internal buses that I can use within Pro Tools software to route from one channel to another within Pro Tools. I might use that to do submixes within Pro Tools. I might use that for effect sends, to send audio from a vocal channel to a reverb box. Anything that you've been using to route internally in Pro Tools, that's what these internal buses are, bus 1 through bus 24. Anything that's mapped to an output is being used as an output to exit the Pro Tools system via an analog output or an AES or a Dante, whatever flavor of I/O that you have. One of the cool things is Pro Tools I/O setup will identify systems that it's been on before. So if I create a session on my system and I send it to you and you have a different audio interface with different number of inputs and outputs. Once it's been there and set up properly, that session can go back and forth between the two systems, and it will automatically adjust the setup. So, and I've created that scenario here. I've got my large Pro Tools HDX system, and I have a laptop system with another Focusrite interface, and I'm going to send this session back and forth and show you just that. Now, the whole purpose of this bus tab is allow sessions to go back and forth between different systems with different input and output numbers as conveniently as possible. And that's quite frequent, to take a session from one system to another, and it's almost unlikely that they're all going to have the different, the same number of inputs and outputs, and that's what where the bus tab comes in. I'm on my laptop now. Let me show you that. We'll go over here to About This Mac, and this is a MacBook Pro, and I have Pro Tools open. Let's go there. I'm opening the session that came from the HDX session with individual hardware outputs. I'm opening it on my laptop that only has a Focusrite with four outputs, but I'm only using two. I need to resolve this mapping issue, so I'm going to go to I/O Setup window, and I can see the bus tab is showing that, hey, that there's a bunch of physical outputs that are not available, right? I only have 4. I'm only using 2. So I'm going to go over here, go to bus. I'm going to select A34 all the way through 24, Shift Option, because I want to apply this change that I'm making right now to all of these selected tracks. I'll go output 1 and 2. Now, all of these tracks that were previously assigned to discrete outputs, audio 1, track audio 1, output 1, audio track 2 to output 2, audio track 3 to 3, and so on, are now being sent out output 1 and 2. But I'm doing this not in the session, I'm doing this in the I/O setup. So the session should retain the same look. Now, so if I look at the track outputs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on, right? It looks the same, but if I held my mouse over it, it's showing me that audio A8 output is being mapped to output 1 and 2. So in this case, all of these 16 tracks I will be able to listen to on my headphones connected to my Focusrite. All right, cool. That's all good. I'm back on my HDX system on Mac Pro. Let me verify that. We go to About This Mac, and it's a Mac Pro. I've got my HDX card with Matrix Studio. I'm going to open up this same session, which is right here. Now, this was just a minute ago opened on my laptop with a Focusrite 2-channel output that I was using, and all 16 channels were being basically submixed or remapped to output 1 and 2 over there so that I could hear them, edit, record, whatever I want to do. I've brought that session back now. I'm going to open it up over here. And the output assignments on the tracks themselves all look good, right? A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 16, no problem. And if I hover over one of them, it should show, that A12 is going out one of 2 tracks because I have the setup as pairs. So if I go to the I/O setup, here's my outputs. I have all of them. And if I go to bus tab, I can expand them all so that A3 goes to A3, 4, and so on, right? And I don't have to remap these now, because if I go back and forth, Pro Tools will recognize, or the session will recognize, that it's been opened on this system before, right? So I can go back over there now. I'm going to close this. I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to rename this so that we can see exactly. Okay, so HDX to laptop. This is the second trip around, right? Okay, I'm on the laptop. I'm back to the laptop. Let me prove that. Here we go, MacBook Pro. Okay, I'm going to go to my Dropbox folder where I saved that session. And here it is. Let's see, it should be HDX to laptop. There it is. So I'm going to open it up. Now I'm not doing any remapping. Here's all of the tracks. If I look at the mix window, it's a little bit easier to see. A1, 2, 3, 4, so on, right? The session has retained all of the routing inside the session, but if I hover over any one of these outputs, I can see that A10 in this particular case for this track has been remapped to output 1 and 2. Now, if I send this session back and forth between these two systems, I won't have to deal with any remapping, rerouting, because Pro Tools is handling it because it's already made this trip back and forth between these two systems. So this works nicely. So the point here is if you're collaborating with somebody else on a different Pro Tools system with a different I/O setup, which is quite likely, take a session before you start working and deck it out as best you can. You know, as the session's going to grow as you go, for sure. But take the session, open it up on both systems, and remap the outputs or adjust the outputs as needed, save the session, and then send it back and try to use that session. You can turn this into a template as well so that future sessions that you create between these two systems will go back smoothly between the two systems. Something to remember with the I/O settings, the inputs, the outputs, the buses, the number of buses, the naming and all that is stored with the session. So you should be able to recall that information from the session itself. Here's how. And it's telling me that the buses have changed, right? Would I like to save a detailed report? No, I don't. But I do want to go to the Open I/O Setup button, click on that, and resolve this. So what I'm seeing right out of the gate is the bus tab has some paths that are not applicable for one reason or another, and I'm going to resolve that by simply recalling the I/O settings that were stored with the session. So if you look at the bottom of the I/O setup, restore from session, I want to apply this restore from session to all tabs. That means the input tab, which looks to be okay actually, the output tab, the bus tab, and any other tabs that I have in here. So I want it to apply to all of them, so I'll have the apply to all tabs checked, and I'll restore from session, and it has resolved the output non-applicable issue that I had a second ago. It's a good idea to save or export your I/O settings files in the event that you lose the naming or the bus layout, the input, output, routing, all that stuff. And it's easy to do. So in the I/O setup of Pro Tools, let me go there. I'll go to setup menu. Still thinking about it. I/O. And down at the bottom, there's export settings, right? So I will set up the routing and the naming. Maybe you've named inputs for particular mic pre's that you're using, or microphones, or kick drum, or guitar amp, whatever you want to associate to those names. And this could become a template. And maybe outputs you've renamed for, main speakers or headphone mixes, or, outputs to other gear that you've incorporated into your session. And of course, buses, internal buses that you've used for submixing or, sends effects, any of those things will be stored in this file. So I'll save this John I/O setup. And it will by default be saved in the I/O settings file. You don't really have to change this location. The default location is great because it's got all of the stock I/O setups. Now, this is handy in a couple of ways, right? So in the event that this session opens up and it loses all of the I/O setup, which if it's opening on this system probably won't happen, but if you're taking this session back and forth, it might. You can always import these settings on a per tab basis, right? So whatever tab I'm on right now, if I choose import settings and I select the file that I just created and I choose open, it will import the settings for that tab only that I'm currently on. So I could do input tab only if I wanted, or bus tab only, or if I want to import all of the I/O settings for all of the tabs, I'll just check this apply to all tabs, restore from session, or import and choose the file that I want. Another way to kind of solidify this, and this is confusing sometimes, is if you're creating a new session. If I go to the dashboard and I want to create a new session, and I'm going to call this IO setup, I always try to make sure to select in this window the IO setup file that I want. For whatever reason, Pro Tools will default to the last use IO setup, which often isn't an issue. But if you have a lot of different sessions coming into your system from other people, other systems, you may want to specifically create an IO file or 2 or 10 or however many you want based on the project that you're working on. And when you create a new session, select that IO settings file based on the session that you're about to do. And that way you can kind of guarantee that the new template or the new session that you're creating will open up with the IO setup that you want. And that's in the Pro Tools dashboard. I'm creating a new session and I can select in the IO settings which IO settings I want to apply. This next section is a recap of another video I've done, but it applies to this whole IO setup window and playback engine, so I wanted to include it here. So you can watch it here, or you can watch it on one of my other videos on my YouTube channel, Pro Tools Services. Thanks. The dreaded some bus paths could not be mapped to their previous output paths dialogue in Pro Tools, everybody's favorite. I know this is a pain in the butt, but here's a couple of ways that you can resolve this potentially quickly or prevent it in the future, right? So what this means typically is that either you got a session from another Pro Tools system that had a different number of outputs as yours, or your Pro Tools system has changed playback engines. And when I mean playback engines, the audio hardware. So for example, maybe your audio interface is turned off and you created this session with that audio interface previously. It's off now, and you open up the session and Pro Tools goes, hey, where's that audio interface with all those 16 outputs or whatever it is? It only sees the Pro Tools aggregate interface with 2. It's going, hey, there's something different with this system as opposed to the last time it was opened. So it's telling you that there's been a hardware change. And a couple of ways to resolve that, first of all, is make sure that your audio interface is set up or turned on, and that it's selected in your playback engine. So I'm going to click no here, and I'm going to go to setup menu, playback engine. Okay, HDX, that is the audio interface that I want. So I'm all good there, but that means that this session maybe came from somewhere else. So how do I resolve this? What I can do, a couple of things. Number one is go back to my IO setup, and it's got a different IO output and bus setup as I previously used on my system. So what I can do is restore from session. The IO setup information is stored within the Pro Tools session document. So I can recall it, as long as I don't hit save right now, I can recall it from the IO setup window using the restore from session. And in this case, the apply to all tabs checkbox is enabled, so it will import or update or restore, I should say, the IO information for all of the tabs, the input tab, the output tab, the bus tab, all of that. And oftentimes that's what I want to do. Restore from session with apply to all tabs enabled, and that usually takes care of everything. If I only want to bring in the IO information from the session from one tab, let's say the output tab or maybe the input, whatever, it doesn't matter. Select the tab that you want to restore from the session, and then hit that. In this case, the input is the same, or the input tab is the same as the system in my session, so there's nothing to restore. But on the output tab, you see restore from session becomes available. Now, Click that and it will update it and you should be good. Now, but if you're going to do the output tab, you should probably do the bus tab too, because the output tab and the bus tab are tightly related. So you probably want to do both of those to resolve any IO settings. Another maybe better way to prevent this moving forward is to store your IO settings or export them. And again, I'll go back to the IO setup file. And, you might go through some effort to name your inputs of your system, the outputs, and of course the buses for internal routing, for submixing or effect sends or whatever you want to do with internal buses. All of those things can be named, and it's a good idea to do that because it really helps organize your session. And it's sometimes timely. So what you want to do is export those settings. So dial the settings in, the input, the output, the bus tabs as you like them, and then click down in the bottom lower left corner of the IO setup file, export settings, and name them IO setup. Maybe it's a date, maybe it's tied to a template that you use. Now, you may have a different IO setup file for different templates that you use. You may have different routing, different naming. So you can have multiple IO setup files based on the project or the session that you're doing. And this is a good idea to create multiple IO setups. So I'll just call it IO setup. I'll call it 07/28/2024. That's today's date. And now, if I want to verify or ensure that any new sessions I create will have the IO settings that I want, I'll go to File menu, New, if I'm going to create a new session. And in the IO settings section, I will select the IO setup file that is appropriate for the session, and maybe it's a brand new blank session, maybe it's a template session, but this way I can ensure that the IO setup that I want will be associated with this new session I've created. So unfortunately, Pro Tools will default to the last use, and more often than not, that's fine. But if you want to ensure that the IO setup that you want is being used, dial it in, export it, and then when you create new sessions, either blank sessions or templates, select the IO settings that's appropriate for that job. And this will minimize any IO settings, and you probably won't see that irritating dialogue very often or at all.